Good evening, and thank you for joining me. This is a short video really to ask questions and to pose some questions about the state of Israel. It's a new state. It was formed in May 1948, and I'm making this program really because of the current war that's going on in October 2023. It's causing a lot of international furore, and the press and the media are reporting on the events because of the Hamas massacre and attack on Israel on Saturday, the 7th of October. This was at the end of the Jewish festival of Yom Kippur, perhaps the most holy of all the Jewish festivals. It's called Yom Kippur, and it's the Day of Atonement, and it's a very solemn festival for the Jewish people. And I wanted to just ask some questions and pose questions and get you to respond and to think about this very new state that came about due to the United Nations taking a vote back in 1948. It was a state that had come out of the Holocaust. The Second World War had finished in May of 1945, and it was only really in May that many of the planned atrocities of the Nazi state came to light. 6 million Jewish people were killed simply because they were Jewish. There were acts of resistance. Many of those were covered up by the Nazis. However, nobody had ever conceived of such industrialized, planned, and systematic killing of men, women, and children. However, in 1948, the formal statement was made after a United Nations vote, and the new state of Israel was created. It was then invaded by several Arab nations almost immediately. And its War of Independence, as it is now called, where the Arab armies were pushed back, is something that I don't really particularly want to go into. But what I do wish to do is just outline some key dates in Israel's history very, very briefly. Suez was an attempt by France and Britain to keep the Suez Canal under European ownership, as it were. And Israel was involved in the Suez Campaign of 1956. Perhaps the most notable date is what has come to be known as the 6-Day War. It happened in June 1967, and it meant that the Israeli state was seen to be an effective military machine that pushed back all the Arab armies and has come to be known as the 6-Day War, and ended in victory, total victory for Israel. And again, I won't go into that particularly, but it was a resounding victory for the Israeli state. And then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War in October 73 was a surprise attack by Egypt and then Syria and then Jordan on the Jewish state. And again, after some initial victories by the Egyptian forces in particular, the Arab armies were checked and pushed back, and a peace deal or a ceasefire deal was made. I want to bring it really right up to date. On October the 7th, 2023, a surprise attack from Gaza into the Israeli heartlands surrounding the Gaza not peninsula, but the Gazan area, where the Gaza people, the Palestine people, are given complete independence. However, it is controlled by an Islamic militant group called Hamas. Maybe not familiar to some British listeners and listeners perhaps wider afield. However, there was a blood-curdling and evil massacre where men, women, children, babies were killed in their own villages and towns. As I speak, I'm speaking on the 14th of October, the battle is ongoing, and Israel has vowed that it will destroy the Islamic jihadi movement known as Hamas. And I just simply want to pose some questions to you. There has been, since 1945, some very strong anti-Semitism, particularly myths that are held or were held in Europe and now completely discredited. Things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which actually had its founding, if you like, as fiction, as complete fiction, but a very anti-Semitic document was created in Russia, we believe, and it has widespread credibility and traction in the Arab world. However, anti-Semitism wasn't just a question of, if you like, a European phenomenon, and it's now spread widely across much of the Arab world. That's not to say that all Muslims are jihadis and all Muslims hold to the extreme jihadi beliefs. However, some do, and some in Gaza have supported Hamas. However, to be fair, they have not had any democratic elections since 2007, and any opposition to Hamas by fellow Palestinians has been very, very swift. The retribution and the killing of anybody else who has a different political outlook. So we're left with entrenched anti-Semitism and entrenched, and I think this is the key word here, hatred of not only Israel, but Jewish people generally. My questions are this: what will the future hold for Israel? Created in 1948 and now in 2023, fighting a cruel and vicious war against a avowed enemy. An enemy, Gaza has received millions and millions of dollars of aid, most of which, it has put into underground tunnels, secret weapons production, and the support by Iran in particular, to encourage it in its training and to encourage it in weapons production and to encourage it by the importation of arms, particularly from Iran. So how does Israel move forward now? Well, I find it quite interesting that in Britain and in the West generally, in America, even in America, which is a supporter, as is Britain, Rishi Sunak lit up Downing Street in the Israeli colours after the 7th of October massacre and heinous wickedness, if you like, where babies were beheaded, where women were raped, and families were just shot. This wasn't a military operation. This was sheer and unadulterated murder. So what does Israel want? What can it achieve? Well, the fascinating thing is that in the West, in America, in Western Europe, many so-called enlightened, liberal, left-leaning people have proclaimed that Israel is an apartheid state. Clearly, that is not the case. It is the only true democratic state in that part of the world. There are other democratic states. I mean, you could argue that Turkey is a democracy, and you could argue that some other states have a semblance of democracy. However, most of them in the immediate neighbourhood are different forms of Muslim government. They're effectively one-party states. You only have to look at Syria under the Syrian regime. So many left-wing leaning people, many people in this country will jump up and down at any atrocity that's created, alleged atrocity by Israel, and they will jump up and down. But when Hamas comes over the border in hang gliders, in breaking the fence in several places, and has a well-planned and well-formulated attack, and then proceeds to massacre at least 1,300 Israelis, to murder them, and it then wounds approximately 3,000, and then approximately 130 of its citizens and people who were living in Israel, not all of whom are Israeli citizens, have been taken back to Gaza as hostages. So is Israel, here's some questions. Is Israel an apartheid state? That's the first question. Is it a colonial state? Is it a state that, if you like, has been produced by the ex-colonial nations of Western Europe? Is it a colonial state? Is it a perfect state? Is it? Does it never make any mistakes? Is it a militaristic state? Is it controlled by an army council, if you like, a junta of generals? Is it a militaristic state? Is it a democratic state? Now, obviously, you'll have your own opinions. And it's quite interesting that about 10 years ago in the United Nations, where they took votes on the Security Council, I think 10 years ago, there were 20 violations against Israel, but virtually none against the most tyrannical regimes in the world at that time. And that's 10 years ago. So countries like Iran, I don't think had any violations against them. Other countries where injustice is very, very blatant, or was very blatant, and possibly still is. Maybe one violation or one Security Council ruling against them in the United Nations. So the United Nations is not exactly a balanced organization at all. So Israel was, just to summarize really, Israel was created as part of a dream in the face of hatred. Russia was one of the first nations in modern history, if you like, to have a very well-shaped anti-Semitism, actually prior to the Russian Revolution in the 1880s, 90s, and the early part of the 20th century. We call those the Russian pogroms. France also exhibited some terrible anti-Semitism, and there was a particularly nasty court case where a French army officer was accused of things that were clearly false, but that was reflective of a wider anti-Semitism in France. And then, of course, we come to the period 1933 through to 1945 with the so-called 1,000-year Reich, and the Nazi Holocaust. The Nazi Holocaust is unusual in the sense that it was a true genocide, in the sense that it was planned, it was systematic, it was an industrialized form of killing, or it became so after about 1941, 1942. And even when Germany was facing defeat on both fronts, the Eastern Front and the Western Front, its killing machine still carried on killing, even in 1944 when German troops took over Hungary. One of their first jobs, if you like, was to send in the SS and to transport Jewish people to the concentration camps of Europe. So Hamas in October 2023. Hamas, I believe the root of that word in Hebrew means violence, and it's violence by Muslim jihadi extremists. These are people who don't know what the future will be in terms of the campaign in Gaza. Nobody knows. Obviously, the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, has its own plans. Hamas will, of course, have its own plans. And whilst one can only condemn the massacre, and it was a massacre, and it was a bloody massacre, and it was wrong and evil, there's no doubt about that. One has to say it was well planned. They lulled the Israeli state into a sense of security. Nobody was expecting it. And they killed far more Israelis probably than they expected. And they certainly don't want peace. And just mention the Abraham Accords, where you've got a number of Arab states who are now making a rapprochement with Israel. And there was even discussions with Saudi Arabia to see whether Israel and Saudi Arabia could come to some sort of agreement and way forward. However, the big question for Israel is Iran. Iran is behind the terrorist group Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, where it's entrenched itself. And of course, we have the Syrian dictator Assad, who is very much in control in Damascus, still very much involved in the importation of weapons and planning and plotting, despite nearly being ousted himself back in the period of the so-called Arab Spring. So I'll leave it there. There's some questions for you, and I don't pretend to have the answers, but they're just some questions, and it's an intractable, very difficult question, some of these, but I thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and give me a thumbs up if you like it. Subscribe to my channel as well. Thank you for those that have done so already, and much appreciated. Thank you, and have a great evening. Goodbye.